It's great to have Lida with us today. Lida is the head of people and talent at Gaia, a UK-based startup supporting families with IVF treatment. Before Gaia, Lida was the head of talent for Netflix in the UK, and she spent 8 years working across their content and production teams in the US and Europe. Welcome, Lida. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. So excited to be here.
So, Lida, you've worked in hiring for quite a long time now, and you've seen a lot of different things. You've hired for a lot of different roles. But looking back on your experience, what's your favorite hire that you've ever made?
Oh, this is a tricky one because there are so many over the years. I would say that my favorite one happens to be one of the first roles I started working on before moving to London with Netflix. So I was already recruiting for the EMEA teams at the time. And the first territory that I was going to be looking after was the Nordics. And we wanted to hire someone that would be essentially choosing what sort of content Netflix makes in the Nordics, specifically in Sweden. And there was a producer I had reached out to who was working at this really cool Swedish production company, and he was not interested at the time. And so we stayed in touch, and I courted him for about two plus years. And every once in a while I'd be like, hey, remember me? Are you interested about potentially joining us? And it was no, until about 2 years later. And then he was like, okay, tell me a little bit more. And one thing led to another, and he joined, and he's part of the team today, based out of Stockholm, which is super exciting. And I extended the offer to him on Christmas that year. So it was just it all came full circle.
What a wonderful Christmas present for everyone involved.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what made you kind of want to stay in touch with that person for so long? Like, what made you think that was such a good fit? Because that's a lot of work, right? That's a long lead time.
So I myself am not a TV creative or commissioner. Over the years, when people talk about the types of stories that they are excited about or want to see on screen, the captivating ones really do stand out, and you start to get a sense for people's creative sensibilities. And I felt like some of the examples he was using, our conversation was just, there was so much depth to it. And I felt like, given what the type of shows that Netflix wanted to create at the time, it felt like it was just such a perfect fit. And he was just so different than some of the other producers that I was speaking with over the years. And I think you get that kind of spidey sense where you just don't want to let go. And so over the course of those 2 years, I feel like I should reach out to him again and see what he's up to.
That's great. Thinking back over the hires that you've made over the years, for you, what's been the difference between a good and a great hire? What sets the great apart?
It's a really interesting question. I think generally speaking, with a great hire, you feel an impact almost from day one. I think looking back and thinking about the truly great hires that I've sort of observed over the years, there is something about the way that they join and instantly their contributions that I think sets them apart. And granted, people have different sort of incubation periods when they join a company, but I do think that there's something to be said about someone who joins and feels like they're able to contribute right away and have some interesting ideas right away. I think also I'm always impressed when someone wants to question and really challenge the status quo and say, well, why do we do it this way? And I feel like instantly it really elevates the way that you think about things. And so I feel like that for me is always super impressive when people join.
Are there any standout examples from your career that you can think back to?
So before I was moving to the UK, in LA, I started working with a colleague who just joined the team, and she was taking over a lot of the teams that I was supporting over the years. And so obviously I felt quite precious about that. And from day one, I just felt like the way that the conversations we were having about the team, she was just grasping things really quickly, again, challenging me on how I've worked with these teams. Neither of us work at Netflix any longer, but we still stay in touch. And she's someone that I go to all the time as sort of an advisor and someone who I feel like can always just push me and really ask me the tough questions and really get me to a place that I feel like I'm just doing such better work.
Love that. Um, Is that something that you're able to spot in the hiring process, do you think? Like, is that something that's really clear when you're interviewing them, or is that something that happens as people on board and as they land, do you think?
I definitely think you see glimmers of it through the interview process. I think especially after a while when you interview and you meet so many people over the years, there are things that you start picking up on throughout your conversations during the interviews. You start refining the questions that you're asking so that it doesn't stay surface level. And so that you feel like you can really get a sense for what that person is like to work with and the sort of impact that they might have once they eventually join. So I feel like you can definitely start picking up on that in the interview process.
What's the most difficult role you've had to hire for?
So I would say that it was our head of commissioning for Germany. Or for German speaking content at Netflix. So the German market in terms of the TV and film landscape is very different to Hollywood. And I had to learn that the hard way because I didn't know much about it until I'd moved and started recruiting for that team. And along the way, I felt like my ignorance and not understanding the nuances of that industry and even culturally just how Germans show up differently potentially than what I'm used to from American executives. It took me a long time. It took me a lot of sort of failed processes and people who didn't end up going sort of all the way in the interview process to realize that I just need to adjust the way that I am engaging with talent, the questions I'm asking, what I'm expecting from in the conversation from their answers and their responses. And I ended up speaking to so many people in that market over the years. And finally, we ended up with this incredible woman who is still there and she still runs the team and functions effectively as sort of the German GM for Netflix there. Her final interview stage was during the pandemic when you were just allowed to travel. And so we had the hiring manager meet, forget, in some random German town. And it was, you had to get really creative, but it felt like there was just obstacles all along the way. But, it ended up with a great hire.
Love that. What was the big mindset shift that you had to make in order to kind of make that hire? What was the most significant one that stands out to you?
So I think based on my experience of growing up in the US, you're taught to know how to sell yourself from an early age. And certainly when you begin interviewing for jobs and you graduate school and what have you. And I was so used to coming from a place where the candidates do the selling and they're really putting their best foot forward and they're being very, proactive and sort of action oriented. And so I expected a lot of that from European candidates and candidates in the UK and in Germany. And I realized that in speaking with people who come from some of these different countries, it's just a completely different mindset. And people have very different expectations on how these conversations are going to go. Someone not selling themselves doesn't mean that they're not interested or don't have the capabilities of being outspoken or brave or bold. I felt like I was confronted with a lot of the stereotypes that I had around what makes a great candidate and what makes a great interview. And I also did a lot of reading about, Nordic culture and German culture and went down all these rabbit holes to understand, how to kind of bridge that gap of knowledge so that I can also be a better recruiter and better interviewer.
That's awesome. When you think back to those processes that you've run, when hires haven't worked out, when the person's been hired, but for whatever reason, it's not been a success. Have you ever seen similar patterns or observations? Have there ever been kind of like similarities in those instances?
I think when you're operating under some sort of constraint, whether it is a time constraint, a budgetary constraint, desperation constraint, I think sometimes your judgment is clouded. And so you're not making a decision from a place of stability and confidence. You're making a decision from a place of fear or, constraints effectively. And I think because your judgment is clouded, you let things slide or you think, oh, well, they don't necessarily of the skill set, or I don't know that they have the potential to do this, but we'll sort of figure it out in onboarding. We'll just figure it out in onboarding. I think that is the kiss of death for making the wrong hire, is hiring from a place of just lack of, confidence and lack of security.
Super interesting. Every hire that I've made that's gone wrong, and there have been several, I've gone into it in that kind of weakened position where it's like, we just really need this to work,
Yeah.
or okay, yeah, sure, this is missing, but if we do it this way, maybe it'll be fine. And
Yeah.
it's almost been like every time we've done that, it's blown up. I've very rarely had it where someone's kind of come in, crushed the process, done amazingly well, referenced brilliantly, and then failed. There's always
Yes,
been those telltales in the process.
absolutely.
And so I think that's really a really key insight there. Is like, if you think something's wrong, it might be.
Yeah. I also feel that lack of engagement from their future line manager, the hiring manager for the role, feel like when there's no engagement or investment from that person in the hire, you end up in a place where you've made the wrong hire in most cases.
What do you mean by that?
Because that stakeholder's perspective was missing, or they just weren't super bought in, or they frankly didn't care enough about the hire. And if you're bringing someone in who is going to be reporting into this person that is kind of apathetic towards that hire, you're not starting that relationship off in a great way, and you're not setting anyone up for success in bringing them into that sort of dynamic.
Yeah, totally agree. Now that you're at Gaia, you're recruiting for all kinds of different roles there, very different from what you were doing in the past. What's the best advice that you'd give a candidate that's interested in a role?
So we talk a lot about our Gaia fours and the values that underpin how we operate. And we've been holding up a mirror to ourselves to say, which of these values do we feel like we really epitomize and really spike on? And which of these values do we feel like we just are not very strong in? And one of those values that we feel like we are not very strong in and need more of that DNA at Gaia is, when in doubt, be brave. So we have a lot of kind, compassionate, intelligent, and really brilliant people at Gaia. I think that sometimes when you have that combination of people, they tend to over intellectualize problems. And for every risky move or bold move, there's 1,000 reasons why you shouldn't do it and why it's too risky, too bold. And you kind of get into this cycle of analysis paralysis. And so what we want is to have people embrace just doing it and just being edgy and just being a bit risky. Obviously using your judgment, doing that within certain constraints, but for me, I really value that in candidates when they give me examples of situations where they took really big swings and they took risks despite, all the odds, despite all of the naysayers and what have you. I love it when people challenge the status quo. I think that is just it's such a incredible thing to have in a candidate and in a hire, someone who's not afraid to go against the grain a bit and really challenge and really push. So I feel like that's something that would be really exciting for us.
Can you think of a candidate that's done that recently? And what did that look like?
So we hired an incredible woman to build our provider network in the US. And she has worked in the fertility space for a very long time. And she was that perfect example of someone from day one coming in and saying, no, we shouldn't do this. This is what we should do. This is what I'm going to go after. This is going to be my strategy. And she's had such an incredible impact in her short time at Gaia. And she's already helped us find so many clinics since she joined last summer. And it was because she felt so confident in taking these big swings and knowing the industry really well, being that domain expert. And, and it's paid off. And we've learned so much from her. Exactly.
It's really interesting because a lot of people give the advice, in your first 90 days, don't do anything, don't make any suggestions, just listen. But the advice you're sort of saying here is actually the best people, they don't sit on their hands and wait 90 days to suggest things. They're right in amongst the action from day one. How do you reconcile that? Like, do you think one is right? Do you think it's contextual? Do you think it depends on the kind of business or the kind of person?
Think that it's always about balance. I think that on one hand, you want to understand how things work and come from a place of curiosity at first to say, okay, why is it that this is how things operate? And why is it that these are our ways of working? Or why is it that this is the strategy? So, that more humble, curious approach. And then instead of kind of sitting on it for months on end, then feeling that you can actually contribute or offer your own opinion or ask questions. I feel like there's so much, it's so exciting when someone feels like they're able to just ask the question as opposed to just taking everything for granted and just taking for everything on board. Again, it's that coming from this place of curiosity.
What advice would you give a person that's received an offer, a candidate in the abstract that's received a new job offer? What advice would you give them? How should they approach that situation?
So I think if it's an opportunity you're strongly considering, it's so important to think back to the very first touch point that you had with that company, with that recruiter, whatever that kind of point A was, all the way through this offer. What has your experience been? What sort of people have you met? What kind of conversations have you had? Context clues have all of these conversations and people sent you. And do you feel like the salary is competitive? Do you feel like it is a great reflection of your skill set and what you're bringing to the role and also what you will be expected to do and your expected output, and weighing all those things? And if you feel like you feel strongly that everything is sort of clicking into place and this is that perfect next career move for you, then great, move forward. I also feel like it's really nice to have someone, a confidant or confidant, or someone who thinks really highly of you and also has your best interests at heart, and speaking to them about it, because those are the people that are going to keep it really real with you. And some of the things that you're maybe thinking, oh, this was a bit of a yellow flag, but I'm just going to go with it. And them saying, well, wait a second. Do you really feel like this is a good idea? And really holding you accountable to making sure that you're making the right decision. I think it's just so important to have that person that you could go to that will keep it real, keep you honest. And that way you're not making a decision from a place of fear, worry, desperation, what have you.
100%. And if the offer wasn't at the level, like say the money wasn't quite right, would you encourage them to negotiate? How would you get them to approach that?
Absolutely. So my advice is always come prepared with your reasoning. If you feel like the offer is not where you want it to be, what does the ideal offer look like? And then what is that delta, right? So I feel like it's really important knowing what the market looks like. So what do similar roles pay in the market, in that industry, in that sector, in that domain? And why, based on your experience, should there be a modification to the offer? Why should they be paying you more? Is it because of something you didn't mention in the interview process? Is it because of some skill set you haven't been able to showcase or didn't maybe talk about enough? So I feel like it's just so important to come back and say, I would like XYZ because of these reasons, and have a really thoughtful response as opposed to just asking for more money. Also, if you don't ask, you don't get. So at the very least, you could have an open conversation. Is it a funding issue? Is the role just different than what you've done in the past? And so the market rate is just different than what you're used to? Is it a different stage company? There's all these different nuances in a different country. And so the market's completely going to look different. So you just kind of have to weigh those things and have a really open and honest conversation.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I see sometimes happen is people come back and they say, oh, well, yeah, what do you think I'm worth? And I think when people approach the conversation in such an adversarial way, it normally leads to less good outcomes. And so I always encourage people, I say, look, work with the recruiter. Like ultimately, if you've passed the process and done well, they want to hire you. And the more clear you can be about what you want, why you think that's the right thing, the more likely you are to get that outcome. If you just kind of put a blocker up and say, oh, pay me what you think, it's very hard for us as recruiters to go back to the business and say, well, they're not going to accept this offer and I don't know what they will accept.
Yeah,
Yeah, that normally leads to a situation where the business goes, well, if we don't think they're going to accept them, we shouldn't offer at all. And I think there's a bit
absolutely.
of there's often bad advice in this world, and I think, as you say, be respectful, be data driven, be kind of clear about what you want. If you do those things, I don't think I've ever seen an instance where somebody has done those things in a polite way and the offer's been rescinded or anything like
Right.
that. I've never seen
Absolutely.
that. Awesome. Last couple of quick questions. What do you wish hiring managers knew about hiring?
So I would say that the quality of the hire also depends on how much effort you put into the process as a hiring manager and as a partner to the recruiter. I think that when hiring managers are disengaged or not invested or absent through the process, typically that doesn't result in a great hire, unfortunately. Or if it does result in a hire, I'm willing to bet that they're not going to stay around for much, much longer, past the start date. So I have high expectations from the hiring managers I work with. I expect a lot of context. I expect engagement, investment. I expect them to really show up for their interviews, and I expect for them to prioritize candidate experience as well, because it's a two-way street. We're interviewing them, but they're also interviewing us. And I have conversations with hiring managers if I feel like they're too busy to prioritize hiring or whatever the case might be. And it's just about being really, really straightforward and constantly making sure that we are equally invested in making this great hire together.
Nice. And what do you wish candidates knew about the hiring process?
So I say this all the time, especially to my, friends and family if they're ever in the interview process and they're like, "Oh, what advice do you have?" And I always say that we are rooting for you. We are rooting for a really great hire. We want you to be the one. We want the role to get filled. We want for you to step into the role. And so I think going into that, knowing that the people on the other side are actually rooting for you, everyone's invested in making this work. Unfortunately, if it gets to a place where it just doesn't seem like the right fit, then you just go your separate ways. But going into it, we're all invested in making a hire and making a hire quickly. So I think not expecting that the people on the other end want you to fail or want it to not go well or whatever the case might be. We're all rooting for you.
Awesome. Well, Lida, thank you ever so much. This has been awesome. And thank you for joining us. And hopefully we'll have you back soon.
Thanks so much, Patty. Really enjoyed it.